Good morning and good evening from wherever you are dialing in from the world today. We welcome you, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, to launch the 8th Global Terrorism Index 2020, produced by our longtime collaborating partner, the Institute for Economics and Peace, one of the world's most impactful think tanks with whom the GCSP has been fortunate to cooperate since 2014. We are especially happy to welcome you today to this event, which is part of our 25 different events that we are hosting in celebration of our 25th anniversary at the GCSP. For me personally, it is also a great moment since I've recently celebrated my 24th anniversary at the GCSP in July. We will be launching the 8th edition of the Global Terrorism Index 2020 shortly. I have here with me today Mr. Serge Stroobants, representing the Institute for Economics and Peace, and Mr. Milo Comerford, representing the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. I will be introducing the speakers to you shortly. I will also offer some of my own insights as well in the next 80 minutes or so. And then Ms. Maria Jose Maldonado will be navigating the chat for us in what I hope will be a lively Q&A session. So if you already have questions in advance, please start chatting away. The world we are living in has never faced such big challenges as today. We have climate change, nuclear threats, cyber risks, and the topic that we will be talking about in depth, terrorism. So I have now the privilege to introduce to you Mr. Serge Stroobants, who will be speaking and launching the Global Terrorism Index 2020. He is a specialist in political science, security and defense, counterterrorism, global risk analysis, and crisis management. He bases his experience on 30 years of experience in the security and defense domains. Underpinned by an extensive academic background with degrees from the Belgian Royal Military Academy, the Vrije University of Brussels, the University of Jean Moulin Lyon III, and the German General Staff College and Vesalius College. So without further ado, I give you the floor. Serge, I look forward to your remarks on the Global Terrorism Index 2020.
Thank you very much, Christina. It's always a pleasure to collaborate with you and with the Geneva Center for Security Policy, and congratulations on your 25th anniversary. And it's also always a pleasure to collaborate with you, Milo, and I'm really appreciating both the contributions that we are going to share with us later in this webinar. So let me share my screen and start with the PowerPoint presentation that is linked to this launch of the Global Terrorism Index 2020. So first, a few words on the Institute for Economics and Peace. So we do a lot of research, but also a lot of consultancy for governments or international organizations such as the OECD, the World Bank, the United Nations, the Commonwealth Secretariat. Our work is included in thousands of university courses, and a lot of our research is downloaded for about 500,000 times a year. Next to the fact that we produce the research, we also like to promote it and to share it with a maximum amount of persons. For this launch, for example, we have had more than 900 pieces or articles, news articles, and a media reach for more than 5.5 billion. So that's the work that we do. And to do so, we are headquartered in Sydney, Australia. We have regional offices throughout the world, one in New York City, of course, connecting with the UN, but responsible for the Americas, working together with the office in Mexico City. So we produce a national peace index for Mexico, ranking the 32 Mexican states according to the levels of peacefulness. Myself and my team, we are working out of Brussels, responsible for Europe, the Middle East and Northern Africa, in collaboration with the office in The Hague. And about 2 years ago now, we opened also an office in Southern Africa, in Harare, in Zimbabwe. So what is the GTI? The GTI is now in its 8th edition. It ranks 163 countries, which is almost 100% of the world population. It is used also as an indicator in the Global Peace Index. So terrorism, or the impact of terrorism, is one of the 23 indicators of the Global Peace Index. It has been very volatile and also one of the most impactful indicators for the Global Peace Index in the past decade. So we produce this report ourselves, and we base the or analysis and also the results of this report on the START Global Terrorism Database, with GTD, managed at the University of Maryland, and that's the most comprehensive database on terrorism in the world. So what about the results for this year? With each of our indexes and publications, we also produce an interactive map like this one. Interactive because you can click on each of the countries and access the data, access the ranking, and access the information you need to understand for this Global Terrorism Index. On the other hand, this map is also showing you countries ranging from very green, which is very good, but that's less than 50 countries in the world, to countries that are red and dark red, and that's very bad, I would say. And this allows you already to identify 3 zones most affected by terrorism in the world. And that would be South Asia, of course, with a concentration in Afghanistan, Pakistan. Then the MENA region, still with Iraq, Syria, Libya, 3 countries of this region. And then we can go south, down in on the African continent, Sub-Saharan Africa, of course, the Sahel region, and a country like Nigeria, but also Niger, Chad, Burkina Faso, Mali. So clearly 3 zones there, most impacted by terrorism in this year's Global Terrorism Index. So when you look at this top 10, you would clearly identify countries that are involved in conflict. You will see not a lot of position moved there, position switches for these 10 countries. But the good news is, and I will show you in the next slide, that we have experienced a decrease in the impact of terrorism last year, and that's a continued decrease in terrorism for the 5th consecutive year now. And so basically, Afghanistan, Iraq, Nigeria, Syria, those are countries that have been really hardly impacted, or impacted in a hard way by terrorism last year. But their figures, the number of attacks, the number of casualties for all those 4 most impacted countries are lower than what we measured in 2018, and somewhere this is good news. So last year we saw a decrease by more than 15% of the impact of terrorism globally. And as I said, this is for the 5th consecutive year in a row. And since the peak of the impact in 2014-15, we are experiencing a decrease by 60% over the past 5 years. So a decrease in 60% of the impact of terrorism over the past 5 years, and that is very good. And as you can see, this decrease was there for most of the most impacted regions. But then we have those other figures that are really disturbing. For example, like a country like Burkina Faso, that went from 86 casualties in 2018 to close to 600 last year by terrorism. So that's a huge increase in the impact of terrorism in this country. So basically, the country most affected by terrorism, and also home to the most prolific terrorist group in the world, is still Afghanistan. And Afghanistan is really a country of concern. Afghanistan is number 1 on a Global Terrorism Index, is the last position for both the Global Peace Index and the Positive Peace Index, and it's also the number 1 country in our ecological threat register. So this is the country most exposed to ecological threats, and also least resilient to absorb the shocks of this threat. So clearly a country that is there in a very bad position at the moment. So now, when you look at the decrease in death from terrorism in 2019, you will find back the countries that I've already spoke about: Afghanistan, Nigeria, Iraq, and Syria, and others that are part of the top 10. And that's something that is really positive to see, even though the figures for those countries are still high. That's more disturbing, and what's really striking there, so this increase in death from terrorism in 2019, is when you look at those 7 countries, you will of course see Sri Lanka, but that's 1 day, 1 set of attacks. But when you look at the 10 countries that are there, you will find 7 countries from Sub-Saharan Africa. And that's basically, next to the fact that we have this global decrease of the impact of terrorism, this is the second main takeaway, and that's the shift of ISIL center of gravity away from the Middle East, and I would say down south into Sub-Saharan Africa. Countries like Burkina Faso, Mozambique, the DRC, Mali, Niger, Cameroon, Ethiopia. Those are countries really affected today by the Islamic State, but also by terrorism as such. For every index that we produce, for every report that we produce, we will always provide a very conservative approach, of a very conservative estimation, evaluation of the economic impact of terrorism in this case, or I would say of violence in for the other reports. So last year, over $26 billion. And of course, we have what we present there are the losses that are linked to the 4 indicators that we use. So the amount of attacks, casualties, injured and killed, but also property destruction and property damages. What we do not count there is, of course, the direct or indirect impact on the economy. We are not counting there also the investments that are made for counterterrorism actions and capabilities. Nevertheless, when you look at Afghanistan, for example, you can see that only for terrorism, 16.7% of the GDP is dedicated to fighting terrorism or countering terrorism. And these figures, if you would look at, I would say, a broader perspective, and you would look at the impact of violence on those economies, this will go up to 30–40% of the GDP that is spent to counter violence in such countries. And that's, of course, detrimental to the development and the stability of those countries. So now let's open a time window to a larger time slot. I spoke about the peak in 2014, and I, of course, spoke about those countries most affected: Afghanistan, Iraq, Nigeria. When you look at this, you, of course, see the steep decrease in the past 5 years, but you also see really the small impact in numbers for Europe and North America, basically the Western world, very, very small impact of terrorism. And most, I would say, most of the largest portion of really the majority of the impact is concentrated in regions and countries outside of Europe and North America. Let's have a look at the deadliest terrorist groups. As I said before, large action on Boko Haram, military action on Boko Haram and the Islamic State with success. So for both groups, I would say military defeats, and the largest portion of their capabilities have been taken away from them, basically only leaving low-scale activities, but also, I would say, larger attention to the internet and the influencing maybe lone wolf actors in Europe, for example, to commit attacks. And that's what we have seen in the past years, and unfortunately also in the past weeks and in the past months. Clearly see there the emergence as a leading terrorist group by the Taliban, but I think what is striking there is also the geographical impact of the actions of those groups. The Taliban basically is only active in Afghanistan and maybe in some portion of the neighboring country of Pakistan, where the Islamic State is trying to influence as many countries as possible. Last year, 27 in number. So clearly another approach and a real concentration of the impact of the most deadly terrorist group in the world being the Taliban. This is a slide showing you the connection between conflict as such and terrorism. 96% of all deaths from terrorism occur in a country that is engaged in conflict. And the figures are there. About 8,000 people were killed by terrorism in a war configuration. 4,000, close to 5,000 more in minor armed conflict. And when you look at non-conflict casualties, that's in the hundreds, more than 500 or around 500. So clearly, a vast majority of the casualties of terrorism fall into a conflict situation. So if you want to fight terrorism, you need to address the, I would say, the most impactful driver, 96%, and that is clearly conflict. This is also showing you the evolution of the regional impact over the past decades. And of course, we see the peak in both Sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East and Northern Africa region with the emergence of Islamic State around 2013, 14, 15, up to 16. But in the past years, what we see is clearly this decrease in the impact of Islamic State in the MENA region. So the MENA region has shifted from the leading in the first position to the third position today. We see also that Sub-Saharan Africa is still in the second position, but of course, with this large impact of the Taliban in the conflict in Afghanistan, but also influencing the security situation in the neighboring country of Pakistan, South Asia today is now the region most impacted by terrorism in the world. So those are the three regions that I spoke about in my introduction. Are we seeing a shift in landscape when it comes to terrorism? Of course, when we compare the decades, I think this figure is very clear. Those are the figures for the 2000s and the 2010s. Clearly, we recognize those three regions that we already spoke about. we also see that for the rest of the world, basically, it was lower. Well, look at those almost 12,000 casualties in the 2000s, and look at those 10,000 casualties in the 2010. So the rest of the world, again, reinforcing the point that I made before, were less impacted in 2010 than, of course, the bulk of the impact in these three regions: Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Middle East and North Africa. When you look at ISIL and the impact of ISIL also in different regions, but also in the way they are impacting, of course, we saw the most or the larger portion of the impact with the creation of the Islamic State, with the peak in 14, 15, and 16 in the MENA region. But what we see now is that both the provinces and the affiliates are taking over in the measure of the impact of groups such as the Islamic State. I spoke about the 27 countries where we had to account for at least one terrorist attack by ISIL in the past year. So this is clearly different from the action of the Taliban, and still very active in a lot of countries, of course, now spreading and most active in Sub-Saharan Africa. And there again, you can clearly see that the gray line on the top, this is the impact in the rest of the world. So almost constant, almost on average. And we clearly see also that the Middle East and North Africa is the impact that is decreasing, and we see both others when it comes to ISIL. So Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia being much more impacted by this international terrorist group. In my introduction, when I spoke about Afghanistan, I spoke about this ecological threat register. Basically, what we see there, or one of the conclusions of this register, is a close combination, almost a correlation between ecological impact and violence. So we see that about 50 to 60% of the countries most impacted by ecological threats and also having low levels of societal resistance are also in the bottom 40 of our peace index and really on the top range of a global terrorism index there. So basically, we need to approach this with a systems or systemic approach analysis and recognize that different factors influencing peace and security are combined here to affect the stability, but also peace in those countries. And for example, you see figures there for mostly African countries. Afghanistan has exposure to 6 ecological threats, and as you can imagine, also very low levels of resilience, being on the last position on the positive peace index. Let's not try to shift away from this mostly religiously inspired terrorism, I would say ideologically inspired terrorism, Islamist terrorism. Let's shift away and let's look at other emerging forms of terrorism. This is a slide showing you the impact from both the incidents and the number of deaths of political movements, but also religiously inspired movements. So when you look at the incidents, you see that politically motivated terrorist groups are much more prolific than religiously motivated terrorist groups. The peak that we see in 2018 is a peak of far-left actions around the G7, G20 summit in Germany, where they try to really disrupt the communication systems and also transportation systems. Now, when it comes to the casualties, so the number of deaths, there you will see that the religiously inspired, the majority of deaths from terrorism in the West came from religiously inspired terrorism. When you look at far-right terrorism, you clearly see the spike now in the, I would say, past decade. And really the attack in Norway by Anders Breivik was the start of this, I would say, positive evolution, a positive influx of the curve. Of course, it's a negative evolution, but the curve started to move up after 2010, 2011, and really this attack in Norway by Anders Breivik. And we have seen, or we have noticed that in the past 5 years, we had an increase by 250% of the impact of far-right terrorism in the West. And of course, when I speak about the West, it's Northern America with the USA, but also attacks in Canada, several countries in Europe, and countries in Oceania, with, of course, last year, unfortunately, 51 casualties in the Christchurch mosque attack. Let's also have a look at the distribution of far-right incidents and death from terrorism. You clearly see when it comes to the number of incidents that the majority there, more than 50%, occur in the United States. And then you have other European countries and countries in Oceania. When it comes to the death, you still see this predominance of the United States, but then you also see this Unfortunately, successful attacks when it comes to the number of casualties, both in Norway and in New Zealand. So that's definitely Christchurch and Anders Breivik. What we have also seen is that 5 countries with the most incidents all decreased in positive peace index in the last 2 years. Now, this is a slide showing you the terrorist attacks by ideology and affiliation over a period of about 50 years. So 60% of the far-right attacks were carried out by individuals with no group affiliation. And that's different from the Islamist type of terrorism. So we all know the names of Al-Qaeda, we all know the names of Boko Haram, of Al-Shabaab, of the Islamic State, of the Taliban. And usually those groups will always claim when attacks occur, even if they did not do it themselves, even if they just inspired doing so. So there you clearly see what they produce themselves and then what they inspired and perpetrated without affiliation. We have about the same measure there for far right, but what we see there is that most of the far right action are inspired, are perpetrated by people that do not belong to a group. So when you look at the Islamist or the ideologically inspired terrorism, you will see these large groups. That is not present as such in the far right scene. So you won't find an equivalent to the Islamic State in the far right scene. There, it is really the strength of the narrative that is inspiring people to commit the attacks. And of course, you see that separatist movements, far left movements, and also environmental terrorism are emerging, and therefore also there are a lot of non-affiliated and affiliated attacks. This is a slide, this is a figure that really struck my mind when I read those figures. So this is looking at basically the evolution within the United States, bipartisan evolution within the United States of the acceptance, at least partially justification of the use of violence to advance political goals. And I would say normal figures in November 2017, so about 3 years ago, and over a period of 2 years, really a small increase from 8% to 15%. But in the past year, we clearly see this spike in the number of people who accept or partially justify the use of violence to advance political goals. And I think this is really disturbing figure. So when it comes to far-right terrorism, and when it comes to opportunities for those extreme movements to thrive in the West, I think what we need to look at are those 6 different attitudes that are on the decline in the West. And of course, you can couple the quality of information with the press freedoms, that is, of course, decreasing. So that is well known. We have also seen that elites are more and more fractioned, and that those fractions start to compete with each other or even struggle with each other. We have seen an attack on our democracy and different types of democracy, different levels of democracy emerging in the past years, less equitable distribution of resources, and we have also seen an increased number of group grievances. For example, in the Global Peace Index of this year, we have made a study on the evolution of social unrest over the past 10 years, and we have seen an increase by 250% of social unrest globally in the past 10 years. So clearly, socio-economic, but also social grievances, social movements that are leading to more discontent and more unrest. So let's have a look at a systemic approach to terrorism. First, data here, it's about the lifespan of terrorist groups. So we shifted from about 102 active terrorist groups in 2002, and about 17, 18 years later, less than 20 of these large ones. So we see that they merged, they disappeared, they just disbanded, they don't exist anymore. And the average lifespan of terrorist groups is about 1 year or less than a year. So that's basically what you need to do if you want to impact, if you want to have a negative impact on terrorist groups. So if you want to make sure that they don't have an impact on yourself. So when you look at terrorist groups, they will flourish when they can increase their influence. And what they need is motivation, recruitment, funding, and media coverage. So that's what you need to target. And we see that these 3 pillars are mutually reinforcing also. So what do we need to do? And I would maybe call it counterterrorism. Make sure that you cut the funding of those groups, but that you also cut the access to their communication channels, the way that they use to really radicalize, the way that they use to influence you, the way that they use to convey the narrative. So counterterrorism, cut the funding, cut access to the communication channels. But you need to put this in connection with also the potential for those groups to recruit sympathizers. And those recruiters, so those people will radicalize other people. What are they doing? Who are they approaching? They're basically approaching people frustrated within society. When I say within society, it's within our own society, but also within the global society. So recruiters are going to approach, I would say, the easy targets, those people who feel alienated from society, that live on the margin of society, discriminated, really, that do not see a future for themselves within this system called society. Those people will be approached, of course, with a dream of a better life, of a future, and of a prominent role in a new society or a new group of friends. So what we need to do there is make sure that only a small number or even no people get at the margin of society, get alienated, and become easy targets for recruiters and radicalizers. So that's the end of my presentation for today. I am really looking forward to the two interventions to follow by Christina and by Milo, and of course also to the question and answer session at the end of this webinar. All our research, also this report, available on visionofhumanity.org, our website, and you can follow us also on different social media channels for, I would say, a positive narrative about peace and about the results of our research. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I'm looking forward to the rest of this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Serge. Thank you so much for your brilliant presentation. It's fantastic. I was really excited about this year's edition. I thought it was really wonderful. The way you also looked at gun violence in the United States, it was really comprehensive. Thank you so much. It is also downloadable for everyone who knows that it's now available online on the website. So I would like to now share my screen and wish me luck here. We are, as you can see in the slide here, in a very wonderful neighborhood surrounded by international actors, the UN, the International Labour Office, the UNHCR, WIPO, and we educate. We have about 80 courses per year. We have over now 9,000 alumni with, I think, 12 chapters across the globe, and we facilitate events like these. And we inspire, we have 300 fellows who also contribute to our work. We have every year about 1,300 course participants, and we collaborate very strongly with government, international organizations, NGOs, civil society, and increasingly private companies. So I wanted to talk to you today about what I call the growing hate pandemic that we see in the world today. I think it has become unleashed a lot, as you can see, by the rise of right-wing extremist groups, but it is now also being fed by COVID-19. And of course, what we need to do, I will try to address some of the ways that we can combat this new kind of global pandemic of hate by global cooperation on content moderation, and then also some ideas about preventing and countering violent extremism. So global right-wing extremism has grown tremendously, as we have heard just recently from Serge, that in the last 5 years, it has grown over 250%. And as you can see here, there were over 350 extremist attacks between 2011 and 2017. So right-wing extremism is on the rise. And one of the things that is extremely worrisome, of course, is this idea of copycat terrorism. A lot of the terrorists learn from each other and share their modus operandi. And after each attack, they ask that the attack be replicated somewhere else in the world. So they first post a manifesto on either the internet, on either Facebook or Twitter and other channels, and then they sometimes attack and live stream the event, and then they call for imitation. So this is the kind of new modus operandi that is happening, and it's a very depressing new thing. And I think one of the kind of wake-up calls of this new type of copycat terrorism came after the 15th of March 2019 Christchurch attack. The attack was live streamed, and where 51 people died and 49 people were hurt. And in the manifesto, the gunman said he also drew inspiration, like Serge, you also said, from Anders Breivik, the attack in Norway. What is also worrisome is that directly after this attack, there were attacks that reverenced the copycat lone wolf of the Christchurch attack. For example, the attack at the Poway synagogue, the El Paso Walmart shooting, the Halle shootings in Germany, and these were all copycat attacks after this. One of the things that, of course, terrorists are using is that they're using modern tools. And what's also very worrisome about this new type of terrorism, where they're using digital tools and social media and the internet, is that there's also fringe fluidity. They are moving from one ideology to the next. Sometimes you can see incels adopting white supremacist language. You see neo-Nazis worshiping Salafi jihadists. So there's this kind of fluidity within the technology that is also inspiring others to adopt different ideologies. One of the really interesting new developments that the internet is also sharing widely is the idea of memes. So the right-wing extremists are trying to reach broad audiences using memes, and it's a type of subversive exposure because it involves deception and duplicity, and it's trying to normalize extremist right-wing ideas by luring ignorant people or vulnerable people like youth, especially gamers, into their milieu. And so what they do is they use an idea or a message or a joke, and they spread it over the internet, usually in a combination of a visual or a text overlay. And they create inside jokes. Sometimes they say things like, global warming is a leftist plot, or it would have been better if the Holocaust happened, or they talk about, they use also an infantile humor using the Pepe the Frog as a caricature, sometimes looking like a Hitler or sometimes looking like a Klansman. And so they're trying to make these kind of visuals very kind of pop culture like and comedic, and it's a way of attracting young people, and it's very worrisome. And why is it worrisome? Well, there are about 160 million memes that are racist that are now running through the internet, and more and more organizations are trying to study the connections between these memes. So one of the biggest responses to the Christchurch attack was the Christchurch call of action. So Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern and President Emmanuel Macron came together in after the attack in Paris to discuss the Christchurch call of action. And what it did, it tried to responsibilize tech companies and ask them to do more, because so many of the live video feed from the Christchurch attack was spread all over the internet. And this, made everyone sort of a wake-up call. Why isn't more being done to take down these terrible extremists' websites and their manuals and their their videos? So what happened was they pushed the Global Internet Forum to Counterterrorism, or GIFCT, to take more action. And GIFCT used to be just embedded within the internet companies of like Microsoft, Google, Facebook, and what they basically called to do is to have this become an independent organization. And now Nicholas Rasmussen is the director of this new independent organization. It's become a 301c NGO in the United States. And what they've created is an independent advisory committee that has a multi-stakeholder approach. It's basically taking directives from Australia, Europe, New Zealand, and the US on taking down websites from government, but it also has all of the many important internet companies on board. I think there's about 14 now, and they use Tech Against Terrorism, which helps them to define some of the internet websites that are either right-wing extremist or Salafi jihadist, and they're trying to take these websites down. So they also have created a unique database of hashes. So 300,000 unique hashtags and 350,000 images and 50,000 videos, and they're disseminating them across the companies to try to teach each other which sites to take down. So it's a very interesting new organization. It's trying really hard, but of course there's the whole question of is it enough? What kind of teeth can this give CTE to enforce? And what kind of influence will it have to prevent terrorism and extremism groups from exploiting the digital platforms? So I guess we have to hope for the best and see what Nick Rasmussen will come up with in next year report on this. But one of the most important things also is the gaming sector. I mean, the gaming sector now has become a place where right-wing extremists congregate and are also trying to track and get young people to join. And they have a captive audience in the gaming world of about 1.8 billion people. So this is not a small place to harvest young minds. White supremacist groups have a long history of creating games to dehumanize enemies and to encourage acts against violent extremists. So one of the things that COVID-19 has been doing as well is take advantage of the COVID-19. Right-wing extremists have been taking advantage of COVID-19. We'll hear a lot more about this from Milo. But one of the things that they've been doing is they've asked people to weaponize COVID-19, so to attack police officers, Jews, Chinese, Italians, non-ethnic people, to literally turn yourself into a bioweapon. They've also are using this to spark what they call an apocalypse. They're claiming that this is the beginning of the race war, and they're calling for mass shootings and political assassinations. Some of the really extremists of the right wing are also talking about creating zones of white-only people. And this is also something that they're doing now during this COVID crisis. So very scary ideas. And of course, one of the things that all countries now are dealing with is disinformation, and it's become a new hybrid threat. If you look, for example, at this year's democracy report, we've also already heard from Serge, but there's now a global decline in liberal democratic institutions. And for the first time since 2001, there are more autocracies than democracies in the world. Hungary is no longer a democracy. It's literally leaving the EU with its first non-democratic member state. In June 2019, Vladimir Putin declared liberalism to be obsolete. So we see this kind of new disinformation is also having its impact on democracies and is boosting autocratic governments. So one of the things we can do to start fighting against these extremist ideas is to recover the digital domain. Digital literacy programs in schools to help enhance critical thinking skills and literally inoculate our children against these extremist ideas. We need to also help internet users to spot manipulation and ultimately weaken extremists that way. There needs to be more de-radicalization projects and more social media analysis in order to understand how to identify and engage with radicalized individuals. And it's important to debunk some of the information that's online. And of course, prevention programs. At the GCSP, we run a course on preventing violent extremism, and it has become a very important course. Just recently, we have found out that one of our students now is leading the PV effort in Mali. Eric Blaze, he is a student of the GCSP, and he's doing that. So that kind of work is important to stop violent extremism. Many world leaders are also now framing the whole COVID problem as an international threat. They're talking about it not being a threat that is us versus them dimension. And this is also very troubling because this is creating more xenophobia, more racism, and more hate. And you can see, for example, in the US and the European far right, they're disparaging all non-white immigrants. And they're creating this context that foreigners are threatening to us. One of the things, of course, is also the Black Lives Matter. It has created an important global movement. I mean, there are 2,000 cities in the US alone that have had marches, but it has also been, is now being used and abused by other right-wing extremist groups like the Boogaloo movement, who are now gaining notoriety, and they're trying to position themselves, some as allies of Black Lives Matter, but some of them against the Black Lives Matter movement. So they're also using this kind of movement to also gain people to join their milieu. So one of the important ways to counter violent extremism is to take a health and human security approach to PVE. The US Homeland Security Department has offered grants, but a lot of scholars are calling to use PVE more for taking a health and human services approach. Germany and Denmark and Australia and Europe, the European Union, are all working on PVE efforts. In Germany, the Federal Ministry for Family Affairs, Women and Youth. In Denmark, the Center on Prevention and Extremism, supporting teachers, social workers, and police. In Australia, the Ministries of Multicultural Affairs are focusing on community partnership action to build resilience and social cohesion, and they're doing a great job. So one of the ways that terrorists are motivated to join is also they use ideologies that incentives that this is a commitment to a moral cause. They use conspiracy theories, which we're going to learn a lot more from Milo. But they're using youth, and I think they're especially targeting young people, vulnerable people, also people coming back, veterans from the military who have PTSD. So it's really a targeted approach. So we need to have a targeted approach as well in order to inoculate our young people against these extremist messages. We have to manage those that have already become extremists, and we have to counter and rehabilitate those that are coming back from the movements. So one of the things we have to work on is ensuring that youth have valuable role models. And I think one of the most important things that we've learned from this COVID-19 is that all of this cannot be done alone, that we can only do this together. And so I really hope that some of these ideas will also give you food for thought on how to deal with extremism in your parts of the world. Thank you. I now I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to give the floor to Milo Comerford. He will talk about how extremist organizations have responded to COVID-19. But first, let me introduce him. He is the Senior Policy Manager for the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. where he's developing innovative research approaches and policy responses to extremism. He has briefed decision makers across the globe on the challenges posed by extremist ideologies, advising governments and international agencies. He's been featured and has written widely, but he's been featured in the global media, CNN, BBC. He's also been a senior analyst at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. Milo studied philosophy and theology at the University of Oxford, and he coordinated a global education program building open-mindedness and resilience to extremism in young people across 30 countries. And most importantly, he has contributed to this year's Global Terrorism Index. So what he will be speaking to you today, you can also read about in the new index. So thank you so much for agreeing to speak, and I look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Christina. And I'm just going to run through a short presentation. Thank you so much for the invitation to join. Really excited to be speaking on this panel and to be here for the launch of the new Global Terrorism Index. The sort of period under study of the index of 2019 didn't include the era of COVID-19, and in some ways is the sort of glorious past before we were all locked down because of the virus. So what I'm really looking at here is pulling out some of the initial trends and qualitative observations that we've noticed throughout 2020 about this changing field of extremism, and how this virus, which has disrupted and fundamentally altered the entire global landscape of economics, of political expression, of geopolitics, of conflict, how this is intersected with extremist and terrorist mobilization. And as Christina mentioned, you can read the full paper that this is based on in the GTI this year, where it's listed in the expert contribution section. Just to kick off, sort of taking a bit of a zoomed out view on how extremists are using and abusing the opportunity provided by this pandemic and its disruptive potential. Really, what we need to understand here is that extremism thrives off uncertainty and chaos, and we have many examples of terrorists and violent extremists seeking to co-opt major crises to achieve their objectives, and really with their aim to alter society fundamentally and to sort of introduce changes in governmental systems to reflect their supremacist ideologies. These kind of opportunities are golden windows for them to mobilize. And we've seen this across a constellation of bad actors. We heard from Christina about disinformation actors mobilizing. We've seen conspiracy theorists flourishing, particularly on online platforms. But the focus of my presentation is really on extremist mobilization, notably groups including far-right and Islamist groups, but also far-left groups who are seeking to use the pandemic to posit supremacist, even violent solutions to a perceived threat to their own in-group, and really sort of fixing the identity and survival of the in-group on opposing an out-group, and that looks different in different contexts. So far-right groups might have an out-group as immigrants or as minority communities, whereas Islamists might look at non-Muslims as an out-group. So these are fundamental to the construction of these ideologies, and so it shouldn't be a surprise in many ways to see COVID-19 being weaponized by extremist groups. Because we don't have the data from the index until next year, you can see some reflections about the sort of broad brush trends in violence that have accompanied the pandemic. In short, it's made some difference to parts of the world that were not in conflict already. So we've seen a decline in violence in largely urban settings, in the non-conflict areas that Serge outlined in his presentation. But we've seen the virus have little effect on situations where there was already a conflict dynamic present. So this means that indirectly, the virus has had a profound impact on conflict zones. And really started to sort of exacerbate existing trends that we've seen already. So some of the trends that were pointed to in the earlier presentation around the worsening of violence in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. We've seen a huge spike in violence in Mozambique over the past few months, making the most of the fact that security services perhaps have other things on their mind, are taking on crisis response opportunities and so on. So do have a look at the paper for more on that dynamic. What I'm going to be focusing on in this presentation is how extremist groups have used and mobilized around these issues, because this can really tell us about the long-term effect that COVID will have on the international extremist ecosystem. So I'm going to start by looking at Islamist extremist group responses. We've seen a range of different approaches and narratives emerging from groups, including Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in Syria, which has really framed the virus as a sort of apocalyptic event and a geopolitical opportunity for them to seize on. We've seen it described as God's work by a number of Islamist groups. ISIS have referred to it in their Geneva newsletter as a soldier of Allah. We've also seen highly conspiratorial accounts of the origins of the virus. So from Al-Shabaab and the IRGC out of Iran, which was designated in 2019 as a international terrorist organization by the US. We've seen it referred to as a Zionist biological terror attack, or as being spread deliberately by Crusader forces. So you see this interaction of conspiracy and hateful and extremist thinking. But we've also seen it being used as a potential opportunity for promoting a narrative of effective governance. So many extremist groups have laid out the actions that they are taking to stop the virus, and really presenting their kind of Islamic approach to defeating the virus as being superior to Western liberal democratic approaches, much like we've seen with other authoritarian regimes who have claimed to have a better handle on the virus than their liberal counterparts. In tracing on a tactical basis, the sort of very specific usage of COVID hashtags, particularly on Twitter, where we've seen coronavirus-related hashtags being used by extremist actors to spread jihadi propaganda, really using in an agile way the evolving online trends to sort of as a hook to pin the spreading of propaganda on. This has had considerable impact. We've seen over 500,000 views on Twitter, for example, from extremist accounts who are using these kind of hashtags. So, whilst they might not be sort of having a sort of profound offline impact, we know that they're getting a lot of eyeballs on them and really using the pandemic as a means of expanding their viewership. Many of these were linking out then to content repository sites that housed huge amounts of jihadist propaganda, which is equally concerning, the kind of spreading of this beyond just the social media ecosystem. On Facebook, we've seen a number of tactics used in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic to really sort of, again, to achieve the objective of propagandizing, of recruiting, and of radicalizing. Through research at ISD, we studied one account network of several hundred accounts, which used a number of different tactics to evade takedown and detection, including masking of propaganda content, coordinating raids on pages, and similarly hijacking hashtags related to the COVID pandemic. This really shows you that these groups are innovating at the moment and looking at what the increased share of the audience that they're getting because of the fact that we live much more online lives these days, how to use that to their advantage and to spread propaganda as platforms take action against them. Moving on to the extreme right, Christina already provided a great overview of what we've seen, but I just wanted to point to some key trends around how far-right groups are mobilizing around the pandemic, particularly using it as an opportunity to call for violence. We saw a huge spike in the number of tweets referencing the hashtag CoronaChan, for example, a kind of internet slang for COVID-19. We saw a huge growth during February, March, and April, after several months of the pandemic having the chance to spread around the world, on 4chan, where we saw many hateful references, and in particular the kind of weaponization and gamification of the virus, where there were claims that you could win points online for spreading the virus or carrying out violent acts against law enforcement, liberals, Muslims, Jews, etc. So again, another major opportunity for mobilization. Slightly more upstream in the more conspiracy space, we've seen extremist mobilization around anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, which have been adapted to incorporate the pandemic. We saw many mentions, for example, around the involvement of George Soros with the coronavirus, huge spikes in that conversation. This takes place within a broader focus on elites throughout the far-right space, where we're seeing in analysis that we've done on Facebook, for example, a spike in references to figures such as George Soros, the Rothschilds, and Jeff Bezos with inherently anti-Semitic overtones, which allow us to, which claim that the virus is a deliberate tool of social control or a plot to kill off certain populations. So these kind of salient narratives in the online space. On the harder end of the spectrum, some work led by a colleague of mine at the Institute, Jakob Gull, has been plotting the use of Telegram, the encrypted messenger app, by far-right extremist groups. Many people on the call will be aware of how this platform has been used by jihadist groups like ISIS in the past. There was a large takedown operation last year of those accounts, and white supremacists have sort of moved in to fill that space. We've seen millions of posts related to white supremacist channels and a range of tactics that are used to glorify terrorism, call for attacks, and spread instructional ideological material. We saw a particular growth in these channels during the COVID-19 pandemic. We saw thousands of users flocking to these channels during that time, including a growth in one channel that was focused on COVID-19 by almost 800% over the course of a couple of months. This network map here sort of points to the interrelated nature of these terrorist channels on Telegram, and really show, as we saw earlier from Christina, the kind of multi-layered challenge that we have in the online space from these kind of extremist ideologies. Now, I'm aware that we're quite short on time, so I just want to sort of sum up the policy implications that I drew out in the paper, really kind of thinking about what they mean in the context of the Global Terrorism Index. And what I sort of settled on was that essentially the kind of mobilization we've seen during the pandemic, as well as the trends that we've seen in the GTI, show the need to understand a rapidly shifting violent extremist landscape, including the organizing principles of the movement. We saw many of these attacks recorded in the latest GTI in New Zealand and elsewhere, where individuals had little or no connection to extremist organizations, and rather connected to sort of broader ecosystems and sort of milieus of extreme right networks that were operating online. And I think that this has huge implication for how we think about this challenge and how governments and companies and civil society organizations respond to it. Because what we're really seeing here is a post-organizational paradigm emerging, where the sort of group-based structures of terrorist organizations are becoming less relevant in many parts of the world. And we need to be thinking about terrorism in a slightly more holistic sense. And this is particularly relevant in the long-term context of COVID-19, where the sort of economic, societal and geopolitical impacts of this virus are going to continue to provide rich opportunities for extremists to pose these sort of supremacist solutions, which have a huge impact on societal cohesion as well as public safety. So we need to be aware of this post-organizational dimension to the challenge as we look at the longer term impacts of COVID-19 and the pandemic and how that impacts on extremism. So I'll leave it there and look forward to answering any questions that people might have. So thank you very much.